This is my presentation of the qualitative research genre of ethnography. My name's Julie Brant, and hello to any fellow colleagues who will be watching this. I certainly hope that if your research interests are looking into ethnography, that this might help you in your journey. So what is ethnography? And in looking at some of the sources, I identified with some of these statements. A qualitative research project where the intent is to provide a detailed, in-depth description of everyday life and practice. A study of the behaviors of people and perceptions that occur within groups, teams, organizations, and community. And another way Reeves said it was a rich, holistic insights into people's views and actions, as well as the sights and sounds of the location they inhabit. And I know later in the presentation we talk about the benefits and challenges, and I really hit on the challenges then more than the benefits, but I think the benefit of ethnography to me is this rich, holistic insight into the views of people and actions that they have in their habitat. And so I think the beauty of ethnography is just all the data collection you can do and the deep perception and views of the researcher and the impact that has on the outcomes. But I also like this idea: ethnographers generate an understanding of culture through the insider's point of view. So some of the details, these helped me to maybe understand ethnography a little bit better. It describes and analyzes patterns of people, culture, organizations, programs. It's an observational methodology for learning about human cultures instead of individuals. It's carried out where people live and work, and this is probably the challenge of it too, but they're usually relatively long studies as the ethnographer seeks to understand what the observations mean, not just what is seen. That really hit home for me with ethnography about it's not just the observations you're collecting, but what do the observations mean when you look deeper. So how do you analyze an ethnographic study? Researchers interpret the data. Ethnographers depend on field notes to discover, to work toward preliminary understandings, to develop interpretations, and eventually to reach conclusions. So they're spending a lot of time with their field notes. And Hoey, this was a resource given to us in our book with Rossman, but he said researchers who are doing ethnographic studies are going to have a very intimate relationship with their field notes. I thought that was kind of weird, but connected with me on how important their field notes are to their study. The data collection looks like the participant observations, the informed or conversational interviews that are specific but open-ended, and ethnographic studies produce data that looked like a narrative description in these forms through quotations, descriptions, excerpts of documents, photographs, maps, figures, tables, text, audio and video recording, transcriptions, which I think is another benefit to ethnographic is the variety of ways you can collect and the data and produce the data. You have lots of different options in how you're studying the culture, the people, the group. And you're getting really close to the subject being observed in their natural setting. I read someone said you're close to them and you're all in, but you're distant at the same time. Well, there were two studies that I read, and this one cracked me up because I remember the 80s with punk rockers, but for some reason when I read this, it totally clicked with ethnography because it was about someone who went in and studied hard rock punkers and soft rock punkers, and so this person, the question was, what is the difference between? So he studied the two different kinds of punk rockers, and it wasn't just about observing the punk rockers. With ethnography, what does that mean? So he saw this data, he watched them, and then why were they dressing different? He noticed and realized that the soft punk rockers at concerts and on weekends were punkers, but when they went to work and in their daily life, they looked normal. They dressed normal. They covered tattoos up, whatever. They always wore their hair in a way that they knew they could change it back during the week. And hard punk rockers always looked the same, whether they worked, whether they were hanging out on the weekend. And so he began to not just look at how they dressed, but why and what they were doing. So that one was kind of a funny study. And another one that I was reading about was an ethnographic study done with pre-kindergarten students in both Europe and Poland. And they were looking at, they studied the use of space and how that impacted the identity of a child. So the setup of the preschool classroom. And they used photographs of many different classrooms and how they were set up, and studied ethnographically the space and how it impacted a child through those photographs. And they interviewed the teachers based on the photographic data they collected. And so it was just another way to know that, an ethnographic study and the variety of ways you can collect data is interesting and valuable. But some of the challenges is an ethnographic study can produce plenty of interesting findings without producing actionable research results. So that could be a challenge. I read in many sources that the commitment to time, to study the subjects, to live amongst them, to make the commitment on the researcher of time to really study not just specific things that are happening, but you're really studying the culture, usually means it's a longer study. And it said many ethnographers spend months or years in a place where they conduct the research, often forming lasting bonds with the people in which they've studied. Because of the amount of time, it can be an expensive study based on the commitment of the researcher's time and the length of time they study. So, well, these were my sources I used, read, and helped me to really dive deeper into ethnography. And I hope that this helps if this is what your study is entailing or maybe looking like as a method. And I have one side note about using Prezi that I didn't know, so this is a side note, but for all you Prezi users, they do not have VoiceOver built into their program yet. And so I ended up creating my presentation in Prezi and then have had to get really creative in the VoiceOver section. So just a heads up for future, if you're using Prezi, it was very frustrating, and I'm shocked that a newer program like that wouldn't have that. But so that's a side note about Prezi.